about childcare and so let me pass it on to Dr. Jennifer Rogers-Brown, who is going to be our moderator today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see all these faces. I'm Jennifer Rogers-Brown. I'm the Treasurer Clerk of the U.S. Women's Caucus. I'm also representing the Sociologist for Women in Society. I'm a professor of sociology at Long Island University. The panel we have today is an NGO CSW parallel event as part of the United Nations Commission on Status of Women, or CSW. CSW 68 started last week and is continuing this week. I say all this because some folks might be joining just for this panel, and I want to give you some of that context. The priority theme for this year is accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. In support of this theme, the U.S. Women's Caucus is hosting today's panel called Who's Minding the Kids? U.S. Childcare as Vital Infrastructure. And we have 3 distinguished speakers. You can see our agenda on the screen. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to introduce you to the U.S. Women's Caucus. We are an alliance of U.S. feminists and non-governmental organizations engaged in joint advocacy at the UN CSW. As part of that advocacy, we hold up the vital role of research, collaboration, and sharing information. And please check out our website for more information. We will hear from each speaker in the row, as you see listed. Linda Smith, Dr. TARYN MORRISEY, and Dr. ALISSA MWENELUPEMBE. Depending on timing, we may have time for 1 question after each speaker. We'll see. And after the last speaker, we'll have a Q&A session, and then hear a closing from Dr. Susan Lee, the Caucus president. So again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We are a caucus bringing different people together, bringing together progressive U.S. feminist organizations for advocacy at the UN. So it really is vital that we get to know you and that you are participating within this group. Our first speaker is Linda K. Smith. She is an Early Childhood Initiative Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and former Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Development at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. You can see her full bio on the screen. Thank you. I know I was going to share my screen for you.
Okay, I think it's up to me now. First of all, thank you to the U.S. Women's Caucus for, I think, a very valuable session here. It is very, very important in our country that people begin to understand as well as deal with the early childhood and specifically the childcare issues that are facing most of our families today. Next slide. Just a little bit about who BPC is, the Bipartisan Policy Center. What I like to say is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. We try to take issues that are of pressing urgency for the United States and create solutions that go across the aisle. And so I think this one, it's fair to say that there's probably not too many issues in the United States today that are more, urgent for the country to deal with. So to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about today is the following. I'll be describing the U.S. childcare system and how it works. My experience has been that most people really don't understand why we are failing at this issue. What is the unmet need for care and the economic impact of that unmet need? What are the current challenges to financing this? And what are we currently spending? Understanding parents' need, which I think is one of the things that often gets overlooked in the conversations. And we at BPC have spent a lot of time looking at parent need, and I'll talk about that more. It's also important to figure out how do we move forward? What are the decisions and the policy levers that we have in the United States that we can actually move the issue with? So go to the next slide. This slide is just a very broad look at childcare in this country. In some of these, we don't have the most current data on yet. We should be getting more current data soon. But I think the first thing that it's very important for the audience to understand is the fact that childcare in the United States is a market system. And I think that has huge implications for how we attack the problems that we are facing. That system is made up of mostly family childcare homes and center-based programs. And you see on the slide that there are roughly 642,400 childcare businesses in this country. They vary in size from small, with about half of our programs care for less than 50 children, which makes it challenging. The numbers of children are a real factor in why the system is failing us. The annual revenue for these programs, and that comes from mostly from parent fees, is $60 billion a year. So that is the revenue that we spend. In a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the investment of public funds, but suffice it to say that it is not even nearly what we need. When it comes to the childcare workforce, the numbers in the workforce are split pretty evenly. 2 million workers overall, split between childcare centers and family childcare homes. We do have an aging workforce, particularly in the family childcare area, with the median experience up there 10 years for a center teacher and about 3.5 years or 13.5 for a family childcare provider. That's pretty good, actually, because of the next column. When you look at the average wage in childcare, and this has gone up significantly since COVID, but the average hourly wage being $13.75 an hour, and that equates to about 28,000, which is barely over poverty in this country. So we have a poorly paid workforce. Nearly half of our workforce qualify for some kind of public assistance program in this country, WIC, food stamps, etc. Most lack health benefits, and also annual leave and sick leave are really problematic. So when you put all that together, still all of these people were considered essential workers during COVID-19, which was incredible that they were indeed caring for our healthcare community, et cetera, not having health insurance themselves in many cases. So I think that the one thing that I will point out in the bar on the side, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more as we go through this, nearly 1/3 of the children under age 6 in this country have or have no access to any regular form of childcare. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the basic need. Next slide, please. The average cost of care, because this is a market system, is expensive. It does vary greatly from state to state, with, as you see on the slide, infant care ranges from about less than $5,000, $4,700 in Mississippi to, as we were talking about earlier, close to $25,000 a year here in Washington, D.C. So that's a very big range. That's for an infant. And then for a 4-year-old, looking at that range from about $5,400 to close to a little over $19,000 in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to show you the numbers a little bit later, but that said, with the cost of care that high, less than 20% of eligible children receive support through the federal block grant, which is supposed to help families afford care in this country. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, we've spent a lot of time at BPC trying to understand the childcare gap in this country. This is the latest report that we have out. However, we'll be publishing a new one sometime in the summer. We now are working on the 50th state. So we will be soon be done with this and have this gap analysis for the whole country. what we did to get to these numbers was we took we looked at the number of children in the state by state with all available parents in the workforce. And so then taking that number and getting the supply data from states' databases, we mapped the distance from children to a childcare slot. And if there wasn't one, obviously they go into that gap. This is the gap for the 35 states that we have published so far. And if you look at that, a gap of 31% is pretty big, and it's even higher in rural parts of this country. So we have what I like to summarize this by saying is we essentially have one space for every 2 children in this country who need care because all of all available parents are in the workforce. Next slide. This looks at the economic impact of the gap in the 35 states that we have looked at. And we took, I think, a very conservative look at the economic impact. It's based on 3 factors: the impact on household income, on business revenue, and on tax revenue. And if you look at that, that is the low estimate looks at states like Idaho, where wages are low and cost of living is down, to the higher end, which is DC, obviously. But there is the range on what it is costing this country in just those 3 areas. So when we get through with the 50 states, of course, those numbers will go up, but they're, I think, for most of us, they should be of concern to the country. Next slide, please. So the failing business model, I want to just talk about that and start by saying what Janet Yellen said this last fall, which I think was important for her to come out and to actually have looked at and acknowledged the childcare system in this country. According to her and to a lot of us, childcare is a textbook example of a broken market. And on the other side of the slide, and here's why. Because simply put, when the cost to produce a product exceeds the ability of the customer to pay for it, you have a broken business model. And that's what we have in this country. On the one hand, we have parents who need care, but have limited ability to pay for it. And then what they're trying to do in many ways is reduce their costs, keep them down, etc. On the other side of the supply equation, and you've all heard, I'm sure, about the workforce crisis in childcare. Basically, we're paying these people so poorly. And yet, if you, on the supply side, if you increase the pay for the workforce, the only place to go in our system of care is to pass that on to parents. And so that's why I say easy, to understand it is a broken market, and we are going to have to figure out sort of how do we underwrite or support the supply side of this equation without passing that on to the parents. And I think that's where we have this big gap. So going on to the next slide, I just want to say briefly, on the right-hand side of this slide are the major funding streams for childcare in this country. And if you look at them, and there are a lot of other things that play into childcare, don't get me wrong, but what we look at here at BPC is those funding streams that actually buy what you would call seats or slots. And there are other programs that support childcare, but they don't buy a space for a child. So here's the ones that are primary are the Childcare and Development Block Grant, which is the federal subsidy program. This last year, it was funded at $8.7 billion. Head Start, which is another program that supports low-income families, it was funded at $12.3 billion. TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which spends of the total block grant for TANF, about $2.9 billion goes to support childcare. Then in the other public set equation are what the states are now putting into pre-K programs. And there are a couple of caveats on the pre-K side. The states right now, the last available data showed the states are spending about 9.5 billion on childcare. And then the private parent fees goes back to the $60 billion in revenue. So the issue here, and I'm trying to be quick on this, with the 3 and 4 year olds going into pre-K in this country, in the childcare model, the 3 and 4 year olds help offset the costs of infants. When you take them out of childcare, it destabilizes the childcare program, and essentially the cost goes up to the parents because there's no offset. And that's based on ratios. The ratios are higher for 3 and 4 year olds than for infants and toddlers. So the business model, again, just doesn't work for the children. So let's go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we have been working on at BPC is looking at what parents want and actually need in terms of childcare, because a lot of the conversation around in this country has been focused on the childcare workforce, the childcare providers, but not so much on what is it that parents are really telling us they want. We have now done 11 different surveys of parents, national surveys, and you can go on our website and look at those. Some of the interesting factoids that I think a lot of people don't know is that in this gets to the nature of some of our businesses in this country. We now know that about 25% of our workers do not know their work schedule more than 2 weeks in advance. So it's actually, for these people, it's almost impossible for them to find childcare. Childcare does not work that way. And so one of the things that we say is that businesses could do a better job of just acknowledging and scheduling their workers. That's pretty heavily in the retail industry, in the service industry, et cetera. The other thing that's interesting is that about a quarter of all parents have told us on several occasions that they need childcare outside the typical business day. And the interesting thing about this is they don't need it necessarily overnight, but they do need it mostly, as the slide says, between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And most childcare programs in this country operate within the typical business hours, say 7 to 5 or 7 to 6. So our system is not flexible when it comes to parent needs. Many parents tell us they prefer informal childcare. We can spend a little bit more time talking about that, but it's very, it does impact this actual need for childcare. I think one of the other things, and some of the other facts are, how much this impacts a parent's decision to go to work, 56%, to reduce their hours of work, 52%, and so on down to quit a job and to leave the workforce. So childcare has a lot of impact on parents in that regard. Let's go to the next slide. A couple of other factoids that we found out in our, in our work, in terms of the parents are paying for childcare. Most are paying for 30 hours or more a week. They prefer it closer to home, there was always a conversation about businesses and businesses building childcare. Our findings are pretty much 2 to 1 that parents want it closer to home. The other thing that I think it ought to be interesting to this group, and I every time I say this to people, I get this, yeah, I know somebody, or this happened to me. Many parents prefer, obviously, a parent or a family member to care for their children. Of those who are using a parent or a family member, 25% of them are moving, literally physically moving their location to be able to get a family member for that care. So that's split kind of half and half between the parents moving closer to their parents, or the grandparents moving closer to grandchildren. But it's mostly grandchildren, 80% grandmothers, and actually people relocating to get childcare. I'm gonna keep going on because I don't want to run out of time, but some other facts there. Can I go to the next slide, please? Again, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone on this call that women bear the cost of this. That women are still out of the labor force more than men, that they left their jobs at higher rates. I think this third bullet on this slide is important because this is the one thing we're finding with our work with parents is that a lot of parents can figure out how to get childcare, how to pay for childcare, as long as that it's one child. But once the second child arrives, that changes the dynamics completely. And if you go back to those numbers about, take for instance, DC and 24,000 for an infant and 19 for the second child, you're looking at close to $40,000 or $50,000 for just childcare for those two kids. So we find a drop off in the numbers of families with two children and their use of the formal care system. I want to keep going to the next slide, please. So I want to talk about some of the potential levers that we have in terms of working on this issue as a country. We have looked at this, not just, you see number 4 on the slide, and there's a big need for more funding for direct subsidies. As I said earlier, only 20% of the children eligible at the federal level for childcare and development block grant funds get that money. And so we've got a long ways to go in figuring out how to support this. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, TARYN, you'll probably say a little bit more about other options other than just fixing the current system. But there are other things that we need to think about. And one of them is infrastructure. In the business model of childcare in the United States, there is no capital for expansion. These programs barely make payroll on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And so getting some policy in this country that deals with the infrastructure, something we've spent a lot of time working on here at BPC and have had some success in getting some things introduced on that. There's also other areas that we can look at in the United States: housing policy, some of the tax and grant programs associated with low-income housing, et cetera. Education policy, and this is twofold. It's an issue of what is the role of education. In many states, the pre-K program is education funding. Is that an option to look at taking some children out of the parent pay category, putting them into public school policy? That's something that is being talked about. But it's going back to what I said earlier, it does have an impact on the childcare that when those kids leave. Labor policies in the country obviously need to be re-examined. And when I say labor policies, I mean things like paid parental leave, paid family leave. We need better leave policies in this country. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this call that about a quarter of young women go back to work in this country after giving birth within 2 weeks, and that there's no rational reason for that at all. I think then the other thing that we talk a lot about is tax policy here. And when I talk about our moving forward with childcare in this country, the best solutions, at least in the work that we're doing, are going to be a combination of, as I said, paid leave policies, and especially maternity, paternity leave, tax policy, and direct spend, which is those direct subsidies to families to underwrite that cost. So I think if we can get to some reasonable sort of mix on some of these things, we could probably do a lot to help programs. One of the things, one of the final things I want to put a pin in, though, is this need to, and one of the things that we learned from COVID-19 was the need for stable funding in our childcare programs. The stabilization money, $24 billion that went in to stabilize these programs during COVID, did work. But I'm afraid that we're not learning much from what happened in COVID. Because when we put that money into childcare, we were able to keep it open regardless of whether or not the parents' pay was coming in. We need to figure out in this country, if we're going to keep a market system, that we have got to stabilize the funding of these programs. And that's putting money into the supply side as much as we put money into the demand side of the equation, which is the parent side. A couple of things, next slide. I think what we have some decisions to make in this country, and others on the call might have some thoughts on this. We haven't made some significant decisions on childcare yet in this country. One of those do we want a system that is universal or targeted? And when I say universal, all children get, or families get support, and we probably should add free to that, or at least affordable. Because right now, it's very targeted. Our federal investments are very targeted to, only the poorest of our families and our children. What is the answer? Do we want to continue with that, or do we want to build a system that allows everyone access to it? Who pays and what share? And we've struggled with this. We still don't know who pays, whether it's the federal government or the state government. And many states are now stepping up to the plate after COVID, but it's very erratic, and it still has very limited access for parents. Parents versus the public, what share, if we're going to continue with a market system in this country, what share should parents pay and what should be the public share of that? And then back to the tax policy, direct spend, and what is the role of business in all of this? Because clearly business benefits from this. How do we engage business in getting some of the solutions here? Another question that has yet to be decided, how do we support parent choice? One of the biggest political conversations right now is making sure that parents have that choice. And that's coming from the conservative side of the aisle in this country. And we have yet to decide in terms of how do we support parents who want to stay home, parents who want to use relative care, parents who want to use their grandmother. And then I think the other thing that we are still struggling with in the United States is, do we build off of what we have or create a new program? And that was the debate recently in the Build Back Better legislation, 2 new programs on top of those that already existed. And that becomes extremely challenging, I would say, for states to manage multiple streams like that. So I think those are the big questions that I would lay out there that the United States still has to deal with. And then finally, I think if we go to the conclusion, I mean, it's pretty clear that we have a big gap, and that childcare, there's a huge unmet need for childcare in this country. That unmet need impacts women, lower income families, rural communities, and families with infants and toddlers more than most. So the solutions to this, I think probably will look different across the states and communities, but need to be driven, in my head, by some better federal policy on this. And we have to make some of these decisions. They're going to be hard to make. But until we make the decisions that I shown on the earlier slide, I don't think we can improve the childcare system in this country. So I'm going to end with that, and hopefully the 2 following me can build off of some of this. But I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to at least try to explain the childcare system in this country.
Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you, Linda. You answered so many questions I had, and I appreciate the data and critical questions. So next we have Dr. TARYN MORRISEY, Professor of Public Policy at the School for Public Affairs at American University, and formerly at the Office of Childcare, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thank you. So you've got it up on the screen.
Thank you so much. And am I sharing my slides really big or am I sharing them small with notes?
No, you've got it correct. And I almost
Excellent.
wanted to say, if anybody has questions, you could start putting them in the chat. We can collect them for later.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to this is such an important conversation. And I love too how the session names childcare as infrastructure. I always like to say it's infrastructure, just like transportation, just like broadband, right? It's become essential, or it is essential for people to get to work and to stay at work, including myself. I have 2 young children who are fortunately in school age because I live in Washington, D.C., where childcare is outrageous. And I think my presentation dovetails really nicely after Linda. I'm a developmental psychologist by training, so I'm going to focus first on children and the implications of our broken market for them and families, and then kind of zoom out. So I want to start with my takeaways. First, many children in the US, particularly low-income and middle-income children, are entering kindergarten not ready to learn. And that's really a missed opportunity for the future and results in achievement gaps in the long term. Second, high-quality early care and education programs can help narrow these income gaps in achievement and development. And third, these programs are very expensive and hard to find, so I'll echo much of what Linda already said. And there's implications for children's development, parents' employment, and the economy. There's sort of these 3 layers that we're failing with our lack of childcare infrastructure. So first, the early childhood period is a really developmentally critical period for brain development. It's about 90% of a child's brain's physical volume develops by the age of as early as 5 years of age. They're very sensitive to positive and negative inputs and experiences, particularly caregiving. Warm, responsive caregiving is what infants and young children need. Unfortunately, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that might be a concept you've heard of before, they're common even among young children. There's no one set definition of ACEs. This can include more extreme experiences like exposure to violence, but it can also, the most common ACE is economic hardship, which is quite common among young children in the United States. So we know that about 45% of children in the US have experienced at least 1 ACE, and 1 in 10 children have experienced 3 or more. And these adverse childhood experiences put children at risk as young adults and older adults for negative physical and mental health outcomes. Oops. Unfortunately, we also know that these hardships increased during the pandemic. So economic hardships, including food insecurity, housing insecurity, and others. So on the left, we see both of these figures are from the Rapid EC project out of Stanford University, formerly out of the University of Oregon. But on the left, we see this figure of families with young children experiencing 1, 2, 3, or 4 hardships from beginning in 2020 all the way through 2023. You can see that the percentages are quite high, even of 4 hardships. And on the right, you can see that there are racial and ethnic disparities in who's experiencing these hardships, with white families less likely, but still more than 20% in any given month, and Black families in general, and Latinx families more likely to experience 1 or more material hardships during this period. You also may have heard of the achievement gap, which is a big concept in US K-12 education. I think what's often not discussed is this achievement gap begins well before kids walk through their kindergarten classroom doors. So this figure is somewhat complicated, but the basic takeaway is that all the way on the left, at age 4, there's a more than 1 standard deviation difference in standardized test scores between children in very high income families, so at the 90th percentile, and children in very low income families, about the 10th percentile of income. So these kids are arriving to school either at age 4 or in kindergarten in very different ways, with different preparation for kindergarten. And that gap is pretty much sustained through age. This figure shows grade 8. So you could take away that K through 8 education is actually doing a really good job at making sure these gaps aren't widening over time. But we have to do something before age 4 to make sure that these gaps don't appear to begin with. And part of this is limiting material hardship, but also increasing exposure to high quality early childhood experiences. Whoops, jumping ahead. So we know that high quality early care and education can improve children's cognitive development. This, again, is another complicated figure, but you may recognize some of the names of these programs. So Perry Preschool was an early care and education program in the 1960s. You see ALISSA in the 1970s, the National Head Start Study, and Boston Pre-K. So these are different, these circles represent different evaluations of different programs over time, and their effect at the end of the year, the end of the preschool year on children's development. This black line indicates most of them are positive. So it's not all. The quality and implementation of a program matters a lot. But we can see that even a modern preschool program, Boston's pre-K program, does have pretty substantial effect sizes in improving children's development and preparedness for school. Unfortunately, as Linda described too, there's large disparities by family income in access to high quality early care and education. Now, this figure shows enrollment rates in center-based early care and education. That doesn't necessarily mean it's high quality. We do know that center-based early care and education tends to be on average a higher education, higher quality in terms of instructional quality than some family childcare arrangements, which tend to just be wider in range. Some family childcare programs might be extremely high quality, some less so. There's a really broad range. But center-based care is much, much more expensive. And so it's not surprising that we see these income disparities in attendance. So attendance in center-based care increases with age. We see 4-year-olds much more likely to attend center-based care. This could be preschool, public or private, childcare centers. It's inclusive of all of those. And then all the way over on the left, you see under age 1, there's massive differences in terms of families' income. That at age 1, a child from a high income family is as likely to attend a center-based program as a child from a low income family at age 3. So there's substantial gaps. And much of this is driven by the sheer cost of childcare, of center-based care in particular. This map is from the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau and shows the median yearly price of childcare across the country. It varies quite a bit. This is at the county level. But these dark blue areas have, in 2023 dollars, the cost of annual infant center-based care is about nearly $29,000. And Linda already explained this too, that our childcare workforce is paid really poorly with few benefits. And this is despite many of childcare workers and early educators having bachelor's degrees or other sorts of child development training. And there's high turnover in the industry. And right now we see a workforce shortage in particular. So on the right, this figure shows, again, from the Rapid EC project, that many childcare workers are facing hardships themselves. More than 5% are facing their own childcare hardship, finding and paying for childcare, and more than 1/4 face food hardship too. Even if you can find it, childcare is really hard, or excuse me, if you can afford it, childcare is really hard to find. These two screenshots are maps from the childcaredeserts.org website, which is from the Center for American Progress. The map on the left is New York City, the New York City area, Manhattan and surrounding Queens and New Jersey. The one on the right is upstate New York, Ithaca, Johnson City. So you see the term childcare desert generally refers to having one licensed slot or fewer than one licensed slot per 3 children under the age of 5. And these orange areas are what are considered where childcare is particularly scarce. So you can see even in an urban area, in the New York City area, there are quite a few childcare deserts. And on the right, in a rural area, there's a lot of childcare deserts and population centers. So there's a lack of licensed childcare, and the licensed care could be center care, or it could be in a formal childcare home or licensed childcare home. I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you who are parents, childcare disruptions affect parents' work, and this happens more so among families of color. So even before the pandemic, this was a major problem, obviously. About 86%, well, one national survey found about 86% of parents reported that problems with childcare hurt their efforts or time commitment at work. And more than 1 in 10 had been demoted, transferred, or fired due to a lack of infant and toddler childcare. And we know that this is more, there are disparities, racial and ethnic disparities in these disruptions. So you see on the left, again, these are pre-pandemic numbers. These are data from 2016 through 2018. But we see these racial and ethnic disparities with about 13% of non-Hispanic, Black, or African-American families more likely or experiencing job disruptions due to childcare. On the right is during the pandemic. From January 2022 through October 2022, at any given month, more than half of parents reported experiencing child care disruptions that affected their work, and I was definitely among them. I think anybody with a parent with a child can identify with this. So there are good news. There is good news. The U.S. has policies that are effective in increasing access to high quality early care and education programs. Childcare subsidies, so these are generally administered as vouchers to help families pay for childcare. And then the direct public provision of early care and education programs like public preschool or Head Start. The bad news, and Linda explained this as well, is that most early childhood programs are really underfunded and reach just a small fraction of those eligible or who could benefit. So childcare subsidies, for example, are targeted to low-income working families. They have income eligibility limits that the federal government sets, but states often set much lower. And there's a lot of evidence that families above those income thresholds could benefit from help. Head Start serves about 40% of 4-year-olds in poverty, and less than 10% of children aged 0 to 3 who live in poor families. And so they're really only serving small fractions of those eligible or who could benefit. And I mean, the educational investments we make by age really show this quite dramatically. So on the left, you can see federal and state as well as local spending on children by age. The federal portion is blue. This is largely Medicaid, so our health insurance program. And then the orange is state, which is more educational investments. You can see we just spend a lot less, arguably when it matters the most in terms of children's development, those first 3 years. We spend slightly more at ages 3 to 5. And then at ages 6 to 17, we spend a lot more, particularly in state dollars. And this is for K through 12 education. In the US, at age 5, when children enter kindergarten, we suddenly agree that they're public goods and we all pool our tax dollars to educate them. But before age 5, it's much more of a private family responsibility. And this is not only when children are developing really, really rapidly and are sensitive to inputs, particularly sensitive to inputs, but it's also when parents are earning the least in terms of their careers when they have young children. On the right, we see it's even more stark when you look at just educational focused investments in particular. And we're an outlier compared to peer nations. So you can see we're all the way on the right, the red circled bar. in terms of the percent of GDP in 2019 that was spent on early childhood care and education. We have states, an increasing number of states have public preschool programs, including Washington, D.C. So my children entered the public school system at age 3, like they would at age 5 in other states. And it was great. It aged down some of the problems of K through 12 education in terms of work hours. I'm one of those individuals who work non-standard work hours. I teach at night. And there's no childcare, certainly in K through 12, available for teaching evening classes. Also, my employer offers childcare beginning at age 2.5, also from 8 to 6. That doesn't match work hours, nor does it match their parental leave policy, which I'll tell you ends a lot sooner than when my children turn ages 2.5. But we see that from Washington, D.C.'s Universal Preschool Program, which began in about 2010, parents, particularly mothers, employment rates increased quite dramatically, about 10 percentage points among mothers with children ages 3 and 4. And that's from a program that's offered during the school day, during the school year. So not necessarily full-time care, not necessarily covering even a traditional work schedule. And so there's not only is preschool an educational intervention, but it's also can move the needle in terms of parental labor force participation. Linda mentioned the childcare stabilization grants that were part of the pandemic relief. These were really vital in keeping childcare programs doors open. On the left, you can see from Rapid EC what the funds were used for by childcare providers, largely for payroll, for keeping staff employed and paid. Also supplies, program site improvement and renovations, program enrichment like books. Unfortunately, the stabilization grants expired in September 2023. And it's been so new, we don't really have great data on how this has affected program closures, but certainly anecdotally, and if you read in the newspapers, there certainly have been closures. On the right, you see the most common concerns about when funds ended. All participants that reported that they, or many participants reported that they were concerned about keeping their businesses open, and that it would be harder to cover payroll and cause more severe staffing shortages. So for current policy debates, there are many at the federal and state and local levels. One is about trying to increase childcare funding to help make up for that shortfall from the expiration of the stabilization grants and other pandemic relief funds. Really shore up our childcare system so that the costs aren't transferred to parents, as Linda explained. And then, of course, there's these are being debated actually in real time during this week in Congress. There's also a proposed child tax credit that wouldn't be as generous as the one that was temporarily in effect in 2021 in the US, but it would provide more funds for low-income families. This could help them pay for childcare, particularly if it's administered every month, as childcare is a pretty regular expense, as anybody knows. So state and local levels, there's a lot of action happening. There are some really great models for increasing provider compensation. So Washington, D.C. has a pay equity fund that helps increase wages for childcare providers and provides health insurance benefits too. And this is particularly important in ensuring equity. We have a childcare workforce that's disproportionately women of color. And they're essentially subsidizing our childcare system with low wages and few benefits. And so correcting that is really key. San Francisco, New Mexico are also really making progress on this too. There's public preschool in most states. However, in most states, it's not like Washington, D.C., it's not universal, it's targeted to low-income or at-risk children. There's also paid family and medical leave. It's in about 12 states right now. But what's missing, I would argue, is that is the most expensive time in a family's kind of trajectory. We have paid family and medical leave, again, only in a few states, but it is covering about half the population. And that's great for the first 6 or 12 weeks of life. It's vital, it's really important. And when families are dealing with illness or other caregiving needs. And then in most states, there's public preschool for age 4 in general, sometimes for age 3, but it's really between the ages of 12 weeks and ages 3 or 4 that's most expensive for families. It's that childcare time and childcare expense for infants and toddlers. And states, it's expensive for everybody. It's expensive for families and it's expensive for states. And so I agree with Linda that we need some federal investment in that. It's states can't do this alone.
Dr. Morrissey, I think we'll have to wrap it up. in a
Oh,
second.
sure.
Yeah,
Well,
sure.
it's last slide.
Okay.
I wanted to add just one more. Our existing public programs can improve ECE access, affordability, and quality, but they're underfunded. And as a result, this exacerbates rather than narrows inequalities. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So many great questions, and I love the connections being made. Again, anybody has questions, you could put them in the chat. We'll save them to the end, or you might see some of the speakers starting to try to answer them. Our next speaker is Dr. ALISSA MWENELUPEMBE. She's the Managing Director of Early Learning at the National Association for the Education of Young Children. I'll pass it on to her now.
All right, thank you. And thank you to my previous colleagues for them setting up, I think, what is a perfect segue into some of the information that I want to share with you all today. So grateful to be able to be here with you all to talk about what, personally, I think is one of the most important topics that we can discuss, and that is the lives of young children and their educators. So I'm going to share my screen. I want to share a little bit about my organization, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and then give you all kind of a first glimpse at some very new data that we collected back in January, which was just released a couple of weeks ago, that drills into some of the specific areas that both speakers have already talked about. So let me get to this next slide. So who are we at the National Association for the Education of Young Children? NAEYC, as we call ourselves many things across the country: NAEYC, NAEYC, NAEYC if you're on the West or the far East Coast. But we are a professional association that serves early educators. We are nearly 100 years old. We're excited to be celebrating our 100th anniversary in 2026. And we are the largest professional membership association for those who educate young children and work on their behalf. We are driven by a mission to promote high-quality early learning for all young children, birth through age 8, by connecting practice, policy, and research. So what I am really excited to be talking about with you all today are the real-life stories, quotes, real situations that are showing up in the lives of our young children and their educators based on some of that data that you've already heard so far this afternoon. And we are really proud to be a BIPOC-led organization with around 60,000 members working to advance a well-prepared, well-supported, and well-compensated, diverse, dynamic early childhood profession. So we work in partnership with our affiliate network, and our affiliates include 51 organizations across 42 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. I'm not going to read all of these aspects to you, but essentially we work with those organizations to really keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in each individual state, in each community, to be able to best support early educators in regards to both federal and state state policy, as well as creating resources like books and journals and articles, professional development, and systems of accreditation that help support the high quality efforts of educators as they are thinking about the work that they do with young children. So we are really proud as a membership organization to be able to center educator voices and experiences. So we knew during the pandemic that our essential role during that time was going to be to lift up the voices of the people who are doing the work every day to support young children. So we have a variety of surveys that we've completed since March of 2020 to really help us understand the challenges that early educators are facing, the challenges that their families that they support are facing, and some of the bright spots that we have seen throughout the last few years that have led to increased support for early educators, but also the areas that we know we need to focus on and we need to continue to grow. So in January 2024, we launched our most recent early childhood workforce survey, and I'm going to share those some of those results with you all today. So we had more than 10,000 early educators across all the states, all 50 states participate across many settings. So 10,000 is a great number for us to work from, and we got a lot of really great data that both supports all of the data you've already heard today and gives us some very individualized experiences that connect that data. We gave some incentives, of course, that helps to drive survey completion, but it was open for less than a month, and we've got those 10,000 responses. What we were looking for was to better understand the actions taken and programmatic impacts over the last 6 months in the wake of stabilization grant expiration across the states. So during the pandemic, states were able to provide a lot of federal dollars to help stabilize the early childhood workforce and economy, to make sure that programs were able to keep their doors open. And so over the last 6 months, those funding streams have started to close up, and we wanted to really understand what those funds have meant to early educators and what potentially will happen when those funds are no longer in existence. We wanted to better understand staff shortages that are driven by low compensation, which TARYN spoke about in her section about those early educators and how abysmally they are paid to do essentially what is some of the most important work in our country. We wanted to understand the rising operating costs for programs and essentially how that's contributing to program closures. So some headlines that we took away. There are staffing shortages and supply challenges. Programs are closing. Provider costs are rising as federal assistance winds down. Staffing challenges persist. Family costs are rising along with provider costs. And public funding really continues to be the answer. We're going to dig into each of those in more depth. So I think this quote here really just kind of expresses how program educators in programs are feeling. So this early childhood educator in Oregon says, "We don't bring in enough tuition to meet salary. Increasing tuition would be a huge hardship on our parents. We need to increase wages, but we can't afford to. I can't find qualified staff and have had to close a classroom. Morale is low. Behaviors are challenging. We are not okay." This director in California says, "There is a demand in my area for care, but we can't enroll more students without more teachers. It's a vicious cycle." That's something that I hear over and over again as I visit with early learning programs across the country. I see beautiful classrooms that are sitting empty. And directors will tell me, "We have a wait list. I have children." We were able to see the childcare deserts that exist. There are programs that have open spots, but they literally cannot bring the children in because they do not have the staff to be able to work with them. This director in West Virginia says, "My wait list is over 400 kids long, and yet I have classrooms I can't open due to not being able to hire staff. Parents can't afford to pay more, and the state has decreased subsidy payments. We need state and federal investments to make childcare more affordable for families and incentives to raise quality. So in our survey, we learned that 53% of directors and family childcare owner operators indicated they are currently experiencing a staffing shortage. 56% reported their programs were under-enrolled relative to their preferred capacity. And under-enrollment then leads to additional issues for that program because oftentimes the way early learning centers are structured and budgeted is on that enrollment number. So when the program's under-enrolled, they don't have the revenue to be able to continue to grow resources, to pay their staff, to be able to provide more opportunities. And that under-enrollment is primarily driven by staff shortages, low pay, and the lack of affordability for families. This professional development coach in Kansas says, we have defaulted on our loan and may have to close soon. We're unable to hire qualified staff because our wages are low. So we raised tuition and lost families. So of the survey respondents, 55% stated that they were aware of at least one program that had closed in their community, and 30% were aware of a new program that had opened in their community. Provider costs are rising, and as federal assistance winds down, this director administrator in Texas says, the two areas of most concern are trying to keep tuition rates reasonable while still being able to give necessary raises to staff. And our insurance costs have increased due to economy, not claims. Over the last 6 months, 36% of respondents reported paying more for their rent. 49% reported paying more for liability insurance. And 53% reported paying more for property insurance. This director administrator in New Jersey says, we haven't been able to raise tuition fast enough to cover wage increases necessary to attract and keep good staff over the last 2 years. Now we can't afford to raise wages again, and we're unable to hire qualified applicants. We have a budget deficit that makes us worry about our long-term viability. 51% of program directors and family childcare owner operators reported increasing wages in the last 6 months. It's a bright spot. But despite the overall trend of increasing wages between January of 23 and January of 24, 46% of total respondents report being more burned out. And twice as many report being economically worse off, 32%, than better off, 16% reported that. The center director in West Virginia says, my wait list is over 400 kids and I can't hire any staff. Parents can't afford to pay more, and the state has decreased subsidy payments. This family childcare provider in Idaho says it's hard to make ends meet, and I don't want to raise tuition too high for parents, but feel like it may end up happening. 48% of program directors and family childcare owner operators reported increasing tuition over the last 6 months. We really believe that public funding continues to be the answer to these challenges. This director administrator in New Mexico says, New Mexico increased funding has had a profound impact on the way we can serve children. We were able to hire more workers, pay more, and enjoy less frustration, anxiety, and resentment among staff. This family childcare owner-operator in Alaska says, we have used and exhausted all of our grant money and are now simply hanging on month to month. If changes are not made on a state or federal level, this industry will surely collapse. I have never seen this industry in worse shape than it is right now. So among respondents who either said their program had received stabilization funds or said the funds had run out, over the past 6 months, those in the 11 states and DC where additional state investments have been made, reported that they were less likely to raise tuition in the last 6 months, and less often reported that their program waitlist had grown in the last 6 months. So we can see that that public investment does make a difference. When states are able to invest more in early learning programs, they don't have to raise their tuition. They don't have to have a large wait list because they can pay staff appropriate wages to be able to staff the classrooms. They can enroll more children, and they can, increase the payment for those workers. So we have been able to drill all of this information down into some state-by-state briefs. We are hopeful that we are going to be able to support the state level conversations as states are thinking about how they are able to support early learning. We can give them some really great data to help them to aid in their decisions. We're also having these conversations at the federal level, but as we know, the US often operates in a state-by-state context, and so we're trying to focus on both of those efforts simultaneously. So the state briefs that our staff have put together contextualize state level experiences relative to the national findings and provide quotes to elevate the voices of educators within each state. I did give you all a link. There's a QR code on the screen here where you can access the state briefs if you're curious about what the brief for your state looks like, or you might want to engage in an advocacy conversation. I think I did see one of the questions that came in was around how can you advocate for these issues in your own context. This is a great resource to be able to do that. It will break down state by state the data that we found by that state. And then I think what's the most valuable thing that we can offer as a membership organization for early childhood educators are those quotes, are the voices of the educators, the program leaders, the owners in the field that are, you can take to your legislator, you can take to those conversations, and, to be able to really center the experience that early educators are having. So I will stop there and, make sure that we have some time for that question and answer session.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think you right there answered the first question I was going to hold up, which was what can we do? But I think I'll give a second here if any of the other speakers would like to help answer that question as well. If you have anything to add around advocacy and change or hope within our system around policy change.
Well, I would jump in on this one, Jennifer, and I would say that most of the problems that I have seen in working in many, many states around the country on this issue is that most people don't understand, as I started out by saying, that this is a broken system. And as a result of that, they don't know what to do about it. And I think that we have got to start from an education angle and ensure that our elected officials just really understand the mechanics of childcare. Because once they get it, and we're doing a project where I am right now in 13 conservative states, we're doing that with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And everywhere we're doing this, we bring business and childcare and state governments to the table and explain the problem. And then once we do that in some of these very conservative states, we see things start to change. And I think we just have to make sure that our elected officials understand the problem before they go after the solutions.
Yeah, I would agree to that and add, I think, talking to legislatures, making your voice heard, talking to reporters, journalists, getting the word out there, because families often just have their heads down and they're just getting by on triage, right? And it's very difficult for parents with young children to speak out on this. I think, one analogy is that, if we were to privatize K through 12 education, it would be pretty expensive per child too, right? Everybody's, I think a question which makes sense, but why is childcare so expensive? It's extremely labor intensive, as Linda described in the chat and in her talk. So, so is K through 12 education, but arguably even less so because there are many more than 4, kindergartners to a kindergarten teacher, and you can't just unlike in college, you can't cram 100 infants into a lecture hall, right? That's not quality. We know that. So I think explaining those dynamics and how we've made it a market, even though it really is, it doesn't lend itself to that, is important.
I think one thing I'll just add to this conversation, and you just kind of spoke to it, TARYN, is that there is a concerted effort to deregulate this system in order to save money. And like, we have to be really careful about that. That's one of the main things that we are focused on at NAEYC to try to push against, because theoretically, yes, more children, more money, less teachers, that should work. But the reality is, when you understand the brain science, when you understand child development, when you understand developmentally appropriate practices which guide our work, you know that it's important to have those small child staff ratios. It's important to be able to have, 4 babies with 1 caregiver as opposed to 10 or 15, which is exactly what Linda was getting at, is like, our system it doesn't work because it relies on those, kind of individualized opportunities and those low numbers. And so, oftentimes I think that people do want to go to like, well, we should just put all the preschoolers in the public system and then, that'll solve all the problems. It really just trickles the problem down, because then we have infants and toddlers who cannot find care and education because the affordability piece doesn't exist. And so I think that this is a complex problem. And sometimes I think that legislators want to approach this complex problem with a simple solution. And the simple solution has unintended consequences.
Can I jump in on this one? Because, we have a model, and when I talk to people in state legislatures, they do begin to understand this. And the successful model taken to scale in this country was the military. And, when we designed the military program, we designed it with a shared responsibility between the Department of Defense and parents. And essentially that system was built on a 1-for-1 share. So the parents pay half, on average, I should say, not every parent pays half, but there was a public investment in that program when we started doing the work on it. And we have yet to figure out why I put in what some of the questions we need answered are, who pays and what share. In the DoD model, it's 50-50, and the parents pay half, and the public through defense dollars pays the other half. And I think we have yet to make that kind of decision in this country. I think in part because of some of the questions we're seeing even here. People don't understand why it costs so much. Now, the other thing that I would say about the military piece is the military, long before the rest of the country has woken up to this, got it that, if they don't have childcare, hey, the troops aren't going to show up at the flight line to fly an airplane or fix an airplane. And the final thing I'd say about the military model, which I think is important, when I asked the question about universal versus targeted, in the military model, a mechanic on the flight line is every bit as important as the pilot in the seat. And so the military model was based on, hey, everybody needs childcare. We need to fix this and make it work for everyone. And I don't think in our country yet we've come to that conclusion. But I think it's a very important question that we start asking ourselves.
Thank you.
Sorry to get preachy.
No, it's great. I have one question here I think fits interestingly with this. I'm going to thank Pam Pro for giving this one to me. She asked, a recent article in The Atlantic discussed the fact that private equity companies have started to get into the field of childcare, which would cause prices to go up further and quality of care to go down. Do you think that is a threat?
I can jump in. I think
Yeah.
so. I mean, there's dated research indicating that, on average, for-profit childcare institutions don't provide as high quality on average as nonprofit. I mean, the profit motive for education and care is somewhat inconsistent with providing education and care in some ways. So, and driving up costs further for families and limiting access is problematic.
I would jump in on that one and just say that, well, I would agree with what Terrence said. I'm very much a realist, and I don't see this country ever moving away from a market system. And I think that then the question that we all have to answer is, how do we work within that to make it work for families? And to be honest, I think that that's going to be the challenge that we have. I've had this question several times, and this is, just a thought on this. We hear frequently that this country doesn't subsidize private industries. And I would say we do it every day. For example, if you look at the farm industry, we cannot afford for this country to lose our food supply. So what do? We have all kinds of support, subsidies, crop insurance, all kinds of things that support the farm industry. And all of it is for profit. So what I've been trying to think through, and what any economists on this call might help with, is how do we work within the system we have and figure out how to make it work so that families can afford a gallon of milk, for example. If you looked at the cost of a gallon of milk, I think today it's like $14 or $15 a gallon if it weren't subsidized by the government. So how do we begin to figure out how we can make childcare work for this country? Because we can't go to work without it, and no more than we can live without food. And I think we have not made the case in the ways that we need to get the kind of support that early childhood needs. In the best of all worlds, I would agree with TARYN that for-profit is not the answer. But again, I just say I'm a realist, and I think we've got to work with what we have right now.
And I'll just add, unfortunately, I agree, Linda, in that I've gotten into a place of, like, I don't want to call it disillusion, because I don't feel like I'm disillusioned yet, but I do feel like it is this realism. And, I'm thinking a lot about some of the comments that I see in the chat about, patriarchy playing a role in where we are as an industry. And might this be an opportunity to shake that up? When we think about these for-profit institutions, these, the folks that are joining us at this point, maybe they don't know anything about early childhood education, but they're primarily men. And so how does bringing men into the conversation shift the conversation into a place of, gaining more resources, getting more visibility, getting more traction? And so, my goal as the seat that I sit in at NAEYC is, like, how do we get to know these folks? How do we make sure that they have all of the information that they need to be able to support high quality in these programs that they are standing up? But then how do we leverage the fact that, they are bringing maleness into this system that might be able to help us get a little further than we've gotten in previous, opportunities. And so I see it as proceed with caution is I think how we are approaching that here at NAEYC, but also, like, how might we leverage this as an opportunity to bring more attention to our causes, and at the end of the day, to be able to elevate the work that we do and provide more resources for the children and the educators.
And I just want to jump in to clarify. I mean, there's a wide range, and I think private equity is a big difference from a mom and pop family childcare home or a mom and pop family or childcare center, which are for profit, but are very much essential to the system.
Good point. I'll pass it on to Susan, and then Shyla. We just have a few minutes left.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. Well, thinking about the funding, public commitment to funding, pretty much everyone agrees that we should fund our public schools for everyone, starting at kindergarten. And I wonder what's different about the 0 to 5 age group. How come people don't feel, yes, we should fund this too. And I wonder, does it have anything to do with the idea that mothers should stay home with their young children? They shouldn't be in the workforce. But on the other hand, we want women to work because that's so essential to our economy and also to families making their budgets. And so I wonder if anyone has a comment on that. And New Mexico seemed to be doing better than other states. And so I wonder, what they're doing right.
Well, New Mexico has gas and oil money, so they're in a unique situation to do that. But I would say Miriam Calderon, who's a leader in the space, says our lack of investment is due to sexism, classism, and racism. And I think you're right. I think this country has ambivalence to women with young children working. We want low-income women to work. We have work requirements, right? But we're not really crazy about wealthy, especially white women working. And so I think we haven't really dealt with that, I think, societally, and that's one result is this lack of public investment before age 5.
I would, add to what TARYN said there, because one of the things that as I said, we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out where parents are and what they want. And one of the interesting things, and I don't know how we change this, we hear all the time, and some of our survey work says this as well, is that parents see early childhood and childcare as their responsibility. And I think that it has been drummed into the brains of young people or parents in this country, that you don't have children unless you can afford them. There's this other thing going on. And so when families tell us, and we've asked the question, who should pay for this? The response is they see it as their responsibility, which is, just totally blows my mind when you put an option on the table that should there be a public-private investment in this. We don't get the overwhelming response that they think that. And I don't know what we do with that. I really don't know. It's mystifying to me.
I think we can go to Shiloh for one last question before closing.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting, insightful discussion. Thank you, all speakers. So it comes down to how we influence decision makers and legislators to move childcare from being seen as a women's issue, seeing as a family issue, and for it to be handled in that manner. It's expected. I think all women of certainly my generation and the one below are all seeing this as their own responsibility on their own. So but the generations after that, the millennials, the Gen Js and so on, they're not seeing it that way. They're expecting childcare to be there. So now we come back to the decision makers, the investors, and so on. How do we change their mindsets? I think the focus needs to be there. So it's not that male perspective of take care of it in the home. It's messy. Don't bring it here. That kind of attitude. We need to very much change that. So if you can comment on that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
I can jump in on that. And I say this coming from a place where I have a Gen Z child in my home. She's 15 years old. And every day I feel more hopeful for the future based on how that generation is thinking about work, thinking about family, thinking about, balancing their life, and just like the openness to new ways of thinking. And so for me, as an early educator myself, someone who supports early educators, I'm thinking about the pipeline of who's coming into this work. How might we be able to leverage some of the dispositions of the next generation to think differently about, they're already thinking differently about our society, about how we show up in spaces. And so how do we bring that to some of these conversations? Eventually these Gen Z children will be politicians, they will be business leaders, they will be all of these things. And so then how do we invest in them so that when it's their turn, they are going to be able to set up these structures that essentially are going to, knock down the systems that exist right now and build new ones. And it feels far away, but we're going to blink, and 15-year-olds are going to be adults, and I feel very confident about that. And so that's where we're focused on as the National Association for the Education of Young Children, is what's the pipeline for early educators look like? How are we investing more resources in early tenure educators to understand how to do policy work, how to advocate, how can we help to set up their voices to be able to be at these tables earlier and earlier than how they've been able to show up before.
Thank you.
I have to add that 30 and 40-year-olds are also thinking in that manner.
As a 41-year-old, yes, I say yes.
Yeah, even 30, 40-year-olds, because I see they're expecting to work and they're expecting childcare to be provided. They're not expecting their mothers to take care of their children. And they're also close to the leadership place we talked about. We need to enable them to become leaders and become the decision makers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, Jennifer.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I know we have our last few minutes here, and I'm going to pass it on to Susan, but I have a hard time not calling on Patricia when Patricia Bradley has her hand up. So is it okay, Susan, if we take
Sure.
Patricia's
ahead.
question? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Comment and question in.
Yeah.
So by all of you, it's in the chat,
Oh,
so I don't have to repeat it. It's just something to ponder.
Okay.
So Jennifer, can you find it in the chat?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can read some of it. She has a nice long comment here saying free non-income specified universal child care investments for all is helpful, but it will eliminate permanent generational poverty and close the wealth gap among lineage descendants of persons enslaved in the US and emancipated in 1865 without reparations. We do better while remaining household with the lowest household income among all American households. Every family in a universal child care for everyone as well. Universal income protection leaves the lineage ADOS at the bottom. Baby bonds has been floated out there. Cash reparations is the only solution for children of parents who are too far behind in household income and without generational wealth during this era of the largest transfer of generational wealth in the history of this nation. I would like speakers how to offer universal benefits that will end generational poverty among lineage, ADOS, I think it's African descendants of slavery, children with everyone above rising higher. Exclusive targeted childcare for lineage ADOS is necessary. So that, I don't know if we have time for responses for the speakers, but you're speaking, Patricia, to some very important questions here about this long history in the US that has led to this massive and growing generational wealth gap. So I don't know if it's possible to do a quick answer to that, but you're right. This is something to ponder, as you said, Patricia.
Sure. If anyone can add that, if any of our panelists would like to address that before we close out, that would be great. Patricia's raised some really great issues.
I wish I had the answer to that, Patricia. I really do. And speaking as a Black woman who, had to fight against both gender and racial discrimination to be able to, find success in my career. I'll just say one place that I have seen a lot of great work done in a similar way was when I spent some time in New Zealand, and New Zealand really used early childhood education as the way to make reparations for the harm they did to their indigenous population. And they were very bold about that. Do I see that happening in the US? Maybe not in my lifetime, but I do think that there are examples. Canada has been doing a lot of work to support their, harm that they've done to their indigenous populations. And so I would love to see that extended into folks who are descendants of slavery, and also to indigenous folks here in the US. So I wish I had the solution there, but I am wholeheartedly in agreement that we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Susan, it's in your hands now.
Well, listen, thank you, panelists, for an amazing presentations, laying out the problems and suggesting some of the solutions too. I think the takeaway messages certainly are that our system is broken. I think that is a real important real important point that we can carry out and, bring that to, other activists and to our communities that something needs to happen with this system. And, we aren't doing the right thing by our children or by our families. And yet this early childhood period is so important for brain development and also for, you know, if not closing the income gap, certainly not contributing to it, by helping our lowest income children do well from a very early age. And I think also we do have to, a takeaway for me is the need for political will to address the issues that it sounds like some countries do have the political will and some states have more political will than others. And even the chambers of commerce can see that there's a problem here. So I think that developing that political will is also very important and something that we can work on. So again, thank you for an amazing presentations on childcare. So important for women in our country and so important for low-income women and women of color, especially. So I think Jennifer said in the survey, in the chat, we're doing a survey. Part of the Women's Caucus mission is to improve the relationship between the United States and the Commission on the Status of Women. So we're doing a survey, and there's an online link in the chat if you would like to fill out a survey, give us ideas about strengthening the presence and the relationship of the U.S. at the CSW. We will stay on, we'll keep our Zoom open for a few minutes if you would like to stay and just chat informally. And if our panelists want to stay, feel free to stay, but of course we understand your time is very valuable. So how about a round of applause for our panelists here as we close out? And thank you all very, very much for coming. So happy to have you here. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and